managing and protecting the world's grueling number of endpoints, enabling Tanium's customers to see, control, and protect every endpoint everywhere. Tanium's mission is to provide certainty in uncertain times with the industry's only converged endpoint management. Trusted by the US military and the majority of the Fortune 100, Tanium helps manage and protect nearly 30 million endpoints. Tanium, the power of certainty. Visit securityweekly.com/Tanium to learn more. Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. Security Weekly listeners save $100 on their RSA Conference 2023 full conference pass. Yes, it is time to start thinking about RSA. Hopefully you already have your hotel and your airfare and stuff like that fills up quickly. The RSA Conference will take place April 24th through 27th in San Francisco and on demand. To register using our discount code, please visit securityweekly.com/RSAC 2023 and use the code 53UCyber. So it's 53 letter U Cyber. We hope to see you there. All right, Ashley Leonard joins us today to talk about advancing zero trust priorities. Ashley is the CEO and founder of Syxsense, which is the unified security and endpoint which is in the unified security and endpoint management space. Welcome to the show, Ashley.
Hi, pleased to be here.
Yeah, pleased to have you. It's an interesting topic because usually when we talk about zero trust, we talk about this huge nebulous thing, that's you got 100 different vendors and they all have to work together. It reminds me a bit of talking about NAC back in the day, if you recall network access control, where, it's like the idea, the picture is all well and good, but getting, 47 vendors to all work together to make it work correctly is kind of a challenge. And that's why I kind of like your approach here is that for it to work, it doesn't have to depend on 47 vendors all working nicely together.
Yeah, I completely agree. If you look at kind of NAC technology, you're quite right. It was a constant challenge to get the vendors to work together, and then once they were, to keep them working together, right? Because if that breaks, it takes the whole system down. So at Syxsense, what we've done is take a very different approach. I think for many people, actually understanding what zero trust really is a challenge, shall we say, because if you think about it, to me, zero trust is more of a methodology, and certainly software vendors can help and assist you on your kind of zero trust journey, but we're really just part of that journey. So the Syxsense approach is different in that we're, as a solution, allow our customers to get started on that journey with zero trust with just our tool. We can certainly integrate into other tools as well to enhance the capabilities, but you really can kind of get started on that journey today.
Right. So let's just let's maybe lay some foundation on zero trust and what the goal is here, what the customer pain point is that you're trying to solve here, because Syxsense does a lot more than just like the zero trust thing. Do you consider that a feature? Is that do you sell it as an additional module? Because like the main purpose of it is managing your endpoints, right?
Yeah, we're a unified security and endpoint management vendor. So what we've done is we've brought together security and endpoint management technologies into a single tool, single license, single agent. And zero trust is really just part of that journey. And I view it as actually just a natural extension of the journey, because as an endpoint management vendor and a security vendor, we actually know about the state of a device in real time. We know whether that endpoint can be trusted. Does it have any critical security vulnerabilities? Are there any critical patches that are missing? Where's the device physically located? Who's logged in? When was it last logged into? So we know a lot about that device or endpoint, and then we can use that data to make decisions about whether a user or an endpoint can access trusted resources. And it can all be done in real time. So again, I think back to your point, it's really just an evolution of where we think the market is moving with unified security and endpoint management.
Right. And is there so the question about like, is this a separate module? Do you have to be at a certain tier to be able to use this, or is this included with any use of the product?
Yeah, great question. So Syxsense is divided into 3 different tiers. We have our manage platform, which is basically a kind of core IT management and patching technology. We have secure that adds on top of that management platform vulnerability scanning, so security vulnerability scanning. And then our enterprise module adds on top of that the Syxsense Zero Trust, but also the ability to do things like automatic security remediation. We have a whole drag and drop workflow engine. So the Zero Trust capability is in our enterprise tier.
Gotcha. Thank you. And Katie, did you have some questions? I know Ashley has an interesting report I want to kind of dive into and talk about a bit, but before we get there, I want to make sure my co-hosts have a chance to ask any other questions about the product itself.
Sure, yeah. So when we talk about Zero Trust, and you mentioned that it's more of a methodology or a principle or a framework, and then you mentioned journey. So can you help our listeners understand, where does that journey start? Does it have to start in one place? How should they progress? Is this an all or nothing type of strategy? You know, where does Zero Trust work and how? I know that was a lot of questions, but it's just they all tie together, I think.
Yeah, it does, absolutely. So we'll start with the kind of first piece, right, which was methodology. So with the methodology, right, the difference, I think, with Zero Trust, and the reason it's a methodology is that the way that you look at your endpoints is that you assume everything is untrusted. So you start from that approach, that everything is not trusted until it can be proven to be trusted. So that's really the methodology. And so when it's the reverse of kind of how you perhaps looked at things in the past, where you looked at, here's a resource that's an important resource, and I'm going to control who can access it. Well, you have to assume everyone is untrusted, everyone's been compromised until they can prove that they're not. Now, as to kind of how you would get started with implementing the Zero Trust methodology, it is a journey, and it's kind of one of those journeys that doesn't really end. It's the way I like to describe it, it's more of an iterative process. So you can get started very, very simply with Zero Trust. And the way I would start approaching a Zero Trust project would be to do an inventory of the technologies that you use today. Many of the tools you use today can be leveraged in your Zero Trust journey, whether you're using endpoint management technologies already, which I hope you are, whether you're using asset discovery, attack surface management tools, two-factor authentication tools, all of these technologies can be used. So this is not necessarily a rip and replace approach. But you want to kind of start with that inventory of your tools. And then I think the next step is to understand what your risks are, what are your kind of high priority targets within your organization, and then what are your assets that you're managing. And still surprising today how many organizations don't fully know all of the assets that they're actually using. I was listening to the previous interviewee from Tanium, right? And I completely agree actually with what he was saying, that it's a constant challenge knowing what assets you actually have in your organization. We actually just did a survey with Enterprise Strategy Group, which we released actually I think yesterday with them. And some of the research we did with them came back with only, I think it's 45% of organizations are managing more than 75% of their endpoints, which is quite chilling to think about, right? That only 45% of the organizations are managing more than 75% of their assets. So, it is a challenge to know what you have out there in the environment and then what they're connecting to. So that's where I would start the project. And you can start with very simple things like using two-factor authentication tools to make decisions about whether particular resources can be accessed. Or you can kind of step it up to a technology like ours, where we take it to the next stage, where we actually know the current security posture of the device in real time, and you can then use that to actually enforce those access controls. But
So, in your
sorry.
opinion, is starting at the endpoint the best place to start? Is it starting at the data level? If somebody has to do a stepwise approach, which seems pretty likely because you can't just zero trust all the things, is, in your opinion, endpoint the better place to start, or do you want to go straight for these so-called crown jewels?
Yeah, well, there's pros and cons to either, right? So the crown jewels you obviously want to protect. So whatever you can do to protect the crown jewels is going to be absolutely vital. But again, with the zero trust approach, what you're looking at is who's accessing those crown jewels. So you're both the device and the user, and then you're making decisions, or you're assuming they're untrusted until they can prove that they are trusted. So again, that approach is a little different because it's kind of a outside-in type of approach. So it's a little bit different than some of the other ways of looking at it.
So that's really why device hygiene is so important. And, it's not just the user, it's not just their credentials, it's what else is on that device, what else can access that device, what policies are in place, what patches are used, etc.
Yeah, it's even more than that. So you think about what's happened recently with COVID, right? Well, it's getting behind us a little bit now, but when COVID hit, everyone went home and started working from home. So they took their laptops, etc., home. Well, if you look at kind of traditional security methodologies, a lot of them, the way they worked is, I like to describe them similar to a castle methodology, where you want to have high walls, right? You put a expensive firewall in place, and you have gates, and you can control access through the gates with VPNs, and it's kind of this castle mentality. And you build the high walls, and you're going to protect your organization. The problem is, once you're inside the walls, there's not much there to protect the organization. So think back to COVID. The devices went home. They went on to home networks. The kids were at home as well. They're on the same Wi-Fi networks. Who knows what your children are up to on the internet, and what they're potentially exposing their devices to, and then potentially yours. You pick that device up. You now come back into the office for a meeting. You plug into the corporate network, and you got a problem. And that's really, I think, where that zero trust approach can really help.
Yeah, and just to unpack something you said earlier, I've talked to a lot of security leaders, and a lot of them have just accepted the fact that, they'll only be able to get asset discovery and then management, even less, to a certain percentage. And 70-80%, I've heard a lot of security leaders say, I'm good if I get to 80%. Like, we're not even close to that yet,
Mm-hmm.
And I think, to unpack something you said earlier, that's a less scary number, I think, if you do have these choke points, like MFA, IAM, identity gateways, things like that, where you can prevent the stuff you don't know about from accessing your most critical data and resources, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I completely agree. I will say, though, that there's, from the survey we did, there's a direct correlation to the amount of unmanaged devices and the number of breaches that those organizations have gone through. And I was actually really surprised at just the level of honesty. And it was obviously an anonymous survey, but we had over 300 respondents, and their organizations typically range between 1,000 and 5,000 endpoints was the vast majority, but we had larger enterprise respondents as well. But I can certainly tell you that based on the results from the survey, there is a direct correlation to the number of unmanaged devices and the number of security breaches those organizations have experienced, as you might expect. I'll actually share one other interesting piece of data from that as well, which was interesting. We asked the question around how many security tools these organizations were using. Because, hey, we're a security software management vendor, right? And we found out that there's actually a direct correlation to the number of tools you use and the amount of breaches you have. And by the way, it's not necessarily the way you might think. The higher the number of security tools you have, the higher the number of breaches you have, which is a very interesting statistic.
Very interesting. So this is actually something I've been talking about in some of my talks. I've noticed, again, I talk to a lot of security leaders, and just from my history pen testing, the companies I had the hardest time with seem to have the least number of security tools, but they really use those tools. Like they use 98% of the features. They knew them really well. They knew how to configure them and use them. And then I would run into these other companies, and I've seen them from both sides, both from the pen testing side, and I created a company that did some consulting services as a result of my pen testing experiences, just to help people finish these deployments, because they'll buy these products, they'll throw them out there, they're all misconfigured, they're not using half of the great features. Sometimes vendors will bury some of the best features really deep in the configurations. Less so these days. I saw that more with like the McAfee's and the Symantec's back in the day. But generally, I've had this kind of theory, and I love to hear that your survey is pulling this out, that just a distraction of the number of tools in the market and the new shiny things, and the overhead that you end up with from owning all these tools, is behind a lot of this. So, why people aren't good at doing security, because they've got so many tools to do it. There's not enough time to configure and use them all properly.
I completely agree. I think a lot of companies think that they can solve a problem just by buying a tool, and we know that, as you do, that's just not the case. You got to have the experience and skills to be able to use these technologies, to properly implement them and maintain them in order for them to be effective. And so just buying a product doesn't solve the problem. And again, frequently more tools actually can be more risk as well. Just look at a couple of years ago, right? The SolarWinds breach itself. So the less agents I think you have on the endpoints as well, the higher the security posture of the endpoint. And that kind of comes back to, I think, the Syxsense value proposition, where we're unifying security and endpoint management, reducing the number of agents that are needed on the endpoint and the number of tools you use.
I would love to see, for every given breach, the ratio of employee to security tool, or security employee to security tool. I would love to see that ratio for every company breached.
Yeah, that would be a fascinating number. That was not a question we asked in the survey. How many employees do you have in security and how many in management? But I agree, that would be an interesting number. And then, of course, how well trained they are. 'Cause it's not just about the number of people, but it's also that experience. And it's so difficult to get skilled security people nowadays. They're in such high demand.
Yeah. And so let's talk about some of the zero trust results here. You asked in the survey a lot of questions about the current status people are in their zero trust journey. And if I were to just guess without looking at your survey data, I would guess most people are in this area of, yes, we're aware of it. It sounds attractive. We want to do it. But we're just completely befuddled and in some state of confusion, vision, right? like no actual work, but it gets talked about a lot, kind of like a digital transformation, right?
Yeah, I walked around RSA last year. I know you were talking about that earlier, and Black Hat, and you see that in all the vendors' booths, right? But when you actually ask them, well, explain this to me, explain how you deliver this, it starts to get really, really confusing. So back to the survey, though. So what we found in the survey, to your point, 62% of the respondents to the survey are currently evaluating zero trust, but only 4.8% have actually implemented something. So I think that completely bears out what you were just saying. A lot of people looking at it, they like the idea. It makes sense. Zero trust makes a ton of sense. But it's really confusing about kind of how you start on your zero trust journey.
Yeah, it sounds a lot like a segmentation project to me. Like we're currently evaluating. Like, the translation is forever in a holding pattern, right?
Yeah. It's well, again, it's to the question I think Amy asked earlier, right? About how do you start? And because there's not a clear laid out roadmap, I think, because it is more of a methodology that everyone is untrusted and everything is untrusted until it can prove that it's trusted, and that's really what zero trust is. It's difficult to figure out how to get started. So as we mentioned earlier, I think you start with that inventory of what tools you currently have, because many of them today are going to help you on that journey. And then what assets you have and what data you have. And that's really where you start that process. And then technologies like Syxsense can really help. We have asset discovery capabilities, so we can scan across all of your networks, looking for all of your assets that you have. And then you're able to, with Syxsense, specify what your high priority crown jewel assets are, and then start to build what trust actually looks like for your organization. And I think that's also really interesting on kind of your zero trust journey, is that it's not really a one size fits all, or even one size fits one organization. For example, right, accessing, let's say, email. Email's important. Obviously, if email gets breached, it can be very disruptive to your organization. But if an individual's email is breached, it's a little bit more limited, potentially, depending on who it is. So your zero trust rules around accessing email could be very different than accessing the payroll system. So as an example with Syxsense, what you'd be able to do is to say, well, for accessing email, we need to make sure that you've been recently authenticated, you're coming in from a known location, and you're fully patched. But if you're accessing the financial systems, well, that's different. Now, you can only access them if you're physically located on this particular network. If you have no critical software vulnerabilities, you have no critical security vulnerabilities as well. So you can kind of build what trust looks like depending on the asset that you're controlling access to with Syxsense.
So let's drill a bit deeper into that, because you're already going in a direction that I was going to take us next in talking about how Syxsense actually enforces zero trust and does zero trust, which it sounds like. It almost sounds like NAC, almost sounds like network access control, where you have a list of requirements that have to be met, a policy that states, okay, you've got to be this tall to enter Salesforce or whatever the application might be, and then a list of the different SaaS network resources, SaaS assets, things like that employees might need access to. And you could maybe have a policy for each of those, right? That's what it's sounding like to me.
It is a little bit like that, I would agree, except the technology is implemented as a combination of SaaS technology and the agent on the endpoint. So it's a kind of combination of the two, along with integrations into other technologies as well, like two-factor authentication tools. So it's a combination of the two. We're not reliant on the network at all to enforce this. It's being implemented and enforced at the endpoint level, which is different than NAC.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I didn't want to compare it directly with NAC. It's more like the, I guess the general approach, like the idea of, okay, you've got requirements and then resources, and then you've got to kind of tie those two together with some kind of policy. It says, okay, here's what you need to do to access it. Like, for example, Duo had a tool. I don't know if they still have their Beyond Core tool, but it did something similar, and it did it from kind of like an endpoint focus. And it was like, it didn't go super deep. There wasn't too much you could do with the policy, but basically you could say, you got to be fully patched. You have to have AV on and working and up to date to be able to access these resources.
Yeah, and I think what we've done there is, because we're an endpoint management and security product, we can take this just to a whole different level of depth on the endpoint. And we have with Syxsense a live real-time connection to the endpoint and at scale. So with Syxsense, unlike a lot of other security vendors that work using polling technology where their agents poll into the server, Syxsense actually has a live connection to your endpoints, which allows us to make informed security decisions in real time on the endpoint. That is very different. And because also, again, we have the history of the device. So the Syxsense asset scanner, for example, when it scans the endpoint, it's scanning all the normal stuff, the hardware and the software on the endpoint and the files on the endpoint, all the normal things you would expect. But we're actually keeping a full history of all this and then tracking how it changes over the life of the endpoint. So you can see kind of unusual things happening on the endpoint. You can see things changing on the endpoint, and how they change could also influence that decision about trust, rather than just a snapshot in time of how the device or endpoint looks right now, this second. We certainly have that, but that ability to look at how it changes over time is pretty unique.
So in terms of risk, a couple minutes ago you talked about risk and risk decisions. How does the product handle risk? Because risk is very subjective. So is there an ability for your customers to refine it based on their business policies? Do you give a risk score? How do you handle that? I'm really curious.
Yeah. So Syxsense has what we call the Syx score, which is a risk score based on the risk that we perceive on the endpoint. So we track risk in a number of ways. We use industry standards. So we use things like CVE scores, for example, looking at a particular vulnerability and how risky that is. But you can actually get very misleading data if you just look at a CVE score, because you're looking at just an individual vulnerability with a CVE score. And as we know, many of the attacks that happen today put multiple vulnerabilities together to create the breach. Because we have that complete picture of the endpoint, we're actually able to better, we think, categorize the real risk of the endpoint. So we're looking at, again, all the complete picture of the endpoint. We certainly take into account things like CVE scores, but we'll also look at, are multiple vulnerabilities present on the endpoint? How's the endpoint configured? Is there a mixture of different types of endpoints on the network? Because all of these could be factors in really how dangerous a particular vulnerability might be. So we score it through our Syx score risk system.
And is there any customization that companies can do to maybe, weight something a little more importantly, if that's mission or business critical to that individual business, or is it just an algorithm based on some of the data you pull in?
Yeah, the Syx score itself is an algorithm, so it's not really possible to weight it. What you can do is create rules around, let's say a patch has just been released by Microsoft, and so, okay, technically that patch is needed on the endpoint, but it was released 2 hours ago. And so you may want to do is to give yourself 24 hours to remediate that patch before you block access to a critical resource, right? Because that's the other element of this is with, I think, zero trust that's really scary for many organizations is that it can be really impactful to business operations. What you don't want to do is to incorrectly block access to resources as well, which could impact payroll, right? Accounting people can't log in, they can't run payroll just because it happens to fall on a patch Tuesday. So yes, you do have those types of capabilities. And then also you yourself can decide what trust looks like for your organization. As we talked about, not only can you define trust based on the resource, but you define it the way that you want to look at it as an organization. Your company may be more comfortable with people accessing the financial systems if they're located, let's say, in the UK as well as the US, because that's where you do business. That's normal business operations, where others may insist that no, financial systems can only be accessed if you're physically inside the United States. So you can define the rules based on your business requirements.
That's great. In terms of unmanaged devices, you mentioned earlier that they're the most likely to get breached. Not a huge surprise there. What happens when companies have an abundance of these unmanaged devices, something they can't put an endpoint agent on, something they can't push policies or updates to? How does your product help that?
Yeah, that's a really challenging run, right? So we obviously support all the major operating systems of Windows, Mac, Linux, and we also support mobile devices as well. But there are a subset of devices, especially IoT devices, that are challenging to manage. And I think the problem that we and other security vendors have is the lack of standards around those technologies. It's rapidly evolving space, isn't it? So IoT is certainly a major challenge for organizations. And today, I think the best approach there is to look at segmentation at network level with those untrusted devices to make sure that their ability to access any of those crown jewels that we talked about earlier are exceedingly limited. So that really is the best approach, I think, at the moment. But things are rapidly developing in IoT management, and I think you're going to see more advanced capabilities coming out in the very near future.
What do you see happening? This is a little bit of a pivot with the work environment. As you said, we were all home for a really long time, and then people started going back to offices, but it's so flexible. A lot of people don't have a set schedule. Their hours are kind of anytime they want them. They can work from home, they can work from the office, they can work from the coffee shop, wherever, because companies learned that they can get better productivity out of people if they give them a certain amount of freedom. So how does that affect the zero trust strategy that a company has to put in place? And how does it affect how somebody would approach endpoint management?
Yeah, it's a challenge. So we actually asked the question when we did the survey as to how many of your organizations are managing remote employees. And I don't think the results there will be surprising. It came back at 97% of surveyed respondents have to manage remote employees. So again, no surprise. Now, kind of how you manage them, well, I think, again, it comes back to that categorization. You start by categorizing the data itself and identifying the risk profile of the resources that you're trying to access. And then you set up different rules based on the criticality or the risk of the resource and data that you're accessing. So is it okay that you can access your email from a coffee shop? Yeah, probably. Be better if you had the VPN running. So maybe you make that as a requirement before you can access it with the zero trust system. But you don't want to be on a public Wi-Fi, perhaps. But it's okay that if you're connecting through from a coffee shop. But should you be able to access the payroll system from the coffee shop? Probably not. So that ability to set the rules, not just based on the endpoint, but also based on the resources that you're actually accessing, I think is really critical there. But it's a challenge. Yeah, managing remote employees is certainly a challenge, but it's also an advantage. We're growing very rapidly as a company, and we've been talking to a lot of the people we've been hiring. We ask them why they're leaving their current company. Often the feedback we're getting is that they're being required to come back into the office and they don't want to go to the office full time anymore. So it's an advantage for some companies when you can offer remote positions to your employees.
For sure. And that's why Zero Trust is like perfectly positioned for it, because it's one of the ways that companies can get a better handle on it. In terms of your clients and the types of people who are more likely, are you seeing adoption in terms of certain sectors, more regulated sectors, or big companies, small companies, or is it all over the board? I know that in the data, we obviously have a little view into the report here, which is great, but you talk about a lot of companies who are thinking about it. They're on the precipice of maybe wanting to do something, but as far as the real numbers go, can you talk generally about the types of clients who are most interested in actually implementing at this stage?
Yeah, only was it 4.3% of people are actually implementing something. So that number is pretty small, but it's projected to grow very rapidly over the next 2 years. So it's a pretty small subset today that are implementing it. And again, I think it's because it's confusing as to what it is and how you get started. So that's a challenge. But if you look at kind of the companies that are, it tends to today be the more sophisticated companies, and often they are compliance driven. So to your point, I think you mentioned, so if a company has to meet compliance requirements, they tend to be earlier adopters of this. So we see a lot of people who deal with HIPAA, PCI, some of the financial compliance requirements. They tend to be the earlier adopters of this type of technology, but we think it's going to spread very rapidly.
Well, hopefully, with only 4-point-something% adoption, there's definitely market growth on this, and it's pretty amazing that. Considering how long the term has been out there and all that uptick that we saw at RSA between maybe 2016, 2018, that time period, talk about zero trust, that we're still sort of in the same place with adoption.
Yeah, I agree. It's surprising, and I think the vendors can do a lot to help, but it's a lot of it's to do with it just being more of a methodology. It's not something you can just buy a solution. You asked the question right at the beginning of our discussion today about kind of where does this end, and it doesn't. It's an iterative journey, right? I would start with the low-hanging fruit, which we talked about, right? The endpoints, protecting the crown jewels, get them secured first with zero trust, and then you start again, and you move down to the next level of resources and the next level of data and get that done. And then you move down again. And then by the time you get to the bottom, guess what? There'll be some new technology and some new stuff, new types of endpoints that are coming into the organization. You're going to have to start the thing all over again. So it really is an iterative process to keep tightening and tightening security within your organization.
That's I can't think of a better place to wrap there, but Ashley, do you have any other insights you wanted to share from the surveys, or anything you wanted to mention that you hadn't had a chance to yet at this point?
Well, if you're interested in taking a look at the survey results, come to our website at syxsense.com, syxsense.com, and you can take a look at the survey results directly from there. So love to be able to show you more information about it.
And we do have that link in the show notes, so you can also check out the show notes if you need to find the link directly to that. All right, Ashley, thank you for joining us on Enterprise Security Weekly today. This was really great.
Thanks for your time. Nice to meet everyone.
All right, we'll be back in a few moments with the weekly enterprise news.